Greetings there, academic proletariat. This is Mr. Olson bringing you today FDR and his response to the Great Depression, the New Deal. This topic is situated in period 7 of your concept outline. Before we begin, I want to make sure that you have with you this sheet. It should accompany you through this PowerPoint presentation, and it will serve as a guide and more structured notes for you to look at later when reviewing this topic. Before we get into FDR, why don't we take a step back in history and talk about Herbert Hoover and his response to the Great Depression. Now, you might remember that Herbert Hoover's response was a little bit lukewarm, and historians kind of frown upon him for his response to the Great Depression. He believed in an idea known as rugged individualism, or this idea that people should be able to help themselves through any sort of catastrophe or any sort of crisis. He was an orphan. He grew up in poverty. He made himself into a successful businessman, went to Stanford, went to China, was in the mining industry, made lots of money, became a very popular and influential politician during World War I, headed the Food Administration during the war, and by the 1920s was on everybody's radar to become the president. Now, he thought that people that were experiencing issues during the Great Depression, that they should be able to help themselves. Later in the Depression, he did show some compassion and created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which is probably his most lasting contribution. This was a government entity that would loan money to corporations such as railroads, such as banks, big construction businesses, in hopes that that money would then trickle down to workers. So the idea was that I give money to a big business, and that big business then hires more workers, and there are less people out of work. Now, Hoover's real downfall, however, came with his treatment of the Bonus Army, which was a group of World War I veterans that wanted early bonuses to help offset desperate conditions caused by the Depression. Herbert Hoover's response to them when they marched on Washington was to send out the army, which then torched the houses and makeshift tents that they were living in. As you notice right here, this is a picture of the military putting out a fire that was caused by the torching of these houses. And if you notice, the Capitol building is in the background there in Washington, D.C. Herbert Hoover, what a guy. I want you to, on your sheet, go ahead and take a minute, I'm going to time it, 1 minute, to answer this question. How would you classify Herbert Hoover's response to the Great Depression go? Okay, kids, your minute is up. If you said something like, he tried, but it was a little bit too little, too late, that would be a good answer. Also, if he was not sympathetic enough to those people that were falling on hard times, notice the two young children here in the corner blaming it all on Hoover. Now, you might have heard of Hoovervilles, Hoover Stakes, Hoover Flags. They were all sort of created to show disapproval of the president. And if you thought that he was a little bit too cautious, that also would be a good answer. Herbert Hoover thought that if he contributed too much to the Depression effort, that it might make the government a little bit too big and border on communism. Now, Herbert Hoover obviously had no chance to win the election of 1932, and FDR wins in a landslide. Herbert Hoover by then was unelectable. The Bonus Army, his lack of response to people that were suffering during the Depression all contributed to him sort of being a completely unelectable official. So FDR sort of slides into the presidency, and from the very beginning, During his campaigning, he offers the people a new deal. He says he's going to give them a new deal and a method of fighting the Depression. Now, even though he's a little bit vague on what this new deal is, he does have several views on how to fix the problems brought on by the Depression. These involve getting the government a little bit more power, involving them in schemes and ways to fix things. He wants to provide sympathy towards citizens because he thinks that the citizens need to feel as though the government is caring for them. And he brings with him this confidence. He's a born politician. Just look at the man. He looks as though he's ready to give a speech. These are the opposite of what Herbert Hoover had, especially in the last part of his Depression. Now, FDR is going to come in, and immediately after he is inaugurated, he is going to let the people know that he is there for them. He institutes what are known as fireside chats, which basically he is going to go over the radio waves, because now everybody has a radio in their house because of the 1920s. And he is going to tell the people that he cares about them. So via these fireside chats, FDR is going to share his plans for the New Deal. He's going to address the people weekly and is going to share with them what he is going to do to make their lives better. Now, before we go on, let's stop and define the New Deal. Okay, the New Deal is FDR's approach to trying to fix the Depression. It obviously is going to involve a little bit more government than did Herbert Hoover. Historians call the New Deal a fundamental shift in the role of the national government in the lives of people. So after the New Deal, people are going to depend on the government, much more so than they did before. Before the New Deal, people, went to the government if they had a problem. Now people, not in addition to going to the government if they have a problem, are going to expect the government to fix that problem. A quote that embodies this is one by Eric Foner. And Eric Foner says that the New Deal made the government an institution directly involved in Americans' everyday lives and directly concerned with their welfare. So it's a pretty fundamental change in how government in America works. Now, right off the bat, FDR is going to get to work. In what is known as his first 100 days, he implements a lot of these New Deal policies and initiatives. So within the first 100 days of being the president, FDR makes his presence known. So the first 100 days are often called the first New Deal, or at least provide the cornerstone of the first New Deal. Which, if you haven't gathered by that, the New Deal period is split into two different segments. So let's begin with the first New Deal, which, like I said, takes place largely in the first 100 days. In these first 100 days, FDR is going to pass or encourage the passing. Remember, Congress does the passing of laws. The president does not do them. The Emergency Banking Act of 1933, which the Emergency Banking Act attempts to fix broken banks. If you recall, several banks had been run on, and so several banks closed because they didn't have money. So what FDR calls for is a bank holiday. He wants to close all of the banks down for an 8-day period. And then if the banks want to reopen, they have to apply to the government to reopen. So FDR and Congress only want to open banks that are able to stay open, that are stable enough. They don't want unstable banks to open because they don't want bank runs to happen again and bank closures to happen again. In addition, FDR and Congress passed the Glass-Steagall Act, which is a second attempt and a further attempt to fix the banking system. The Emergency Banking Act didn't fail by any means, but the Glass-Steagall Act just takes it a step further. It creates the FDIC, which insures bank deposits. So when you put your money into Chase Bank or Bank of America, when you walk in the front door, it's going to say FDIC on it because it lets you know that that bank is insured by the federal government. So if for some reason that bank closes, the federal government promises you up to $250,000 back. So no need for bank runs anymore because the government has your money. Continuing with the first New Deal, they create the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC. This is just the beginning of several acronyms. So be wary. The CCC hired about 250,000 young men to go work on conservation programs and conservation projects. They might contribute to building national parks or creating national parks. Perhaps they fix up conservation areas that had been desolate from years of inattention. But this gives young men who would otherwise be on breadlines a job. Here we have a picture of young men working. Looks as though it's in a forest, looks as though they're building something. If you notice, this one has an axe. There are piles of lumber in the background. Looks as though they're getting ready to build something. The Tennessee Valley Authority is probably the most well-known New Deal program. Its purpose was to provide rural Tennessee and Appalachia with social and economic development. Most notably, the Tennessee Valley Authority built hydroelectric dams like this one here that provided electricity to places that didn't have it prior to the New Deal. Notice there are a lot of men there working on a job that, had it not been for the government funding, probably would not have been a job. Therefore, these men would most likely have been out of a job. Next, FDR and Congress implement the Agriculture Adjustment Act. The purpose of this act was to fix the broken farming sector. If you recall, the farming sector that had lost a lot of its value and farms had gone under and farmers had to sell their land or it had been foreclosed upon was one of the large contributing factors to the Great Depression. So FDR and Congress sought to fix the broken farming sector. So one way that they did this was they paid farmers not to grow as much. Now some of you might be saying that sounds ridiculous. Pay people not to work? Well, if you pay farmers not to grow so much, that means that they don't have the oversupply, which doesn't drive down prices and does not lead to deflation. So as you notice in this picture, there are a bunch of young kids that are definitely thankful for the government's new attention to the agricultural sector. Continuing with the first New Deal, I know that this is a lot, bear with me. FDR and Congress created the National Industrial Recovery Act. The purpose of the National Industrial Recovery Act was similar to the War Production Board during World War I. It provided a government takeover of the economy to some degree, and this aimed to facilitate or to look over corporations and make sure that they were on their best behavior. So this would make sure that workers wouldn't go on strike, because when workers go on strike, that decreases production, puts the economy at a halt. As a result of the National Industrial Recovery Act is the Wagner Act, and Section 7A of the National Recovery Administration is this Wagner Act, which is a very fundamental piece of legislation. It guarantees workers the right to unionize and the right to collectively bargain, which means that employers cannot fire you because you are in a union, which, even though it's a good idea, still really doesn't work. Corporations are shiesty. They figure out ways to get around that. And lastly, actually not lastly at all, we have some more to go. The Federal Emergency Relief Agency was an agency that sought to provide immediate relief to those citizens that were most in need. So those citizens that might be starving or might be in dire need of obtaining food. FDR was kind of hesitant about just blind handouts. This was the one exception to that rule. He wanted to make sure that people worked for their benefits from the government. And rarely did he just hand stuff out. This was one instance in which he did. He thought that people that were in the most dire need of things still needed some relief, and they got it via FERA. Here's a line of people outside of a soup kitchen waiting to go in and be fed. These would have been the people who would have benefited from FERA, that they absolutely could not find a job. Continuing with the first New Deal, the New Deal created the Public Works Administration, which was an agency that appropriated federal funds for public works projects. So if you look at this picture, obviously this excavating company is working to dig some sort of building. It might be a post office, it might be a library, it might be something like that. But as you notice in the background, there is a Public Works Administration billboard hanging up. And now, lastly, in the first New Deal, it creates the Civil Works Administration, which gave projects that were focused on the community. So here you have several young men who are getting ready to make a new field for Washington High School. I have no idea where that is, but if you're making a new field for a local high school, that would be a project that it contributes to the community. Now, the first New Deal and the second New Deal are sort of divided by a period of criticism that came upon FDR's response to the Great Depression. While there were many critics of the New Deal, three stand out as most important. First critic was a man by the name of Francis Townsend. He's pictured right here. He criticized the New Deal for not doing enough for the elderly. So he wanted FDR to put in place some sort of agency or plan to provide funding to people that were either too old to work or disabled and could not work. We're going to come back to this idea in a second. Next, one of the most outspoken critics and most flamboyant of the New Deal critics would be Huey Long, or nicknamed the Kingfish. Here he is, and if you notice, he's in the middle of a great speech. He is somebody who criticized the New Deal for not fixing the wealth gap. He wanted to limit people's yearly income or annual salary at $1 million. He thought that if you made over $1 million, it should be taxed at 100%. That sounds like a good idea to me, especially on professional athletes. If you make over $1 million, all that money should go into a fund, which then pays young people to go to college. I will say that until the day I die. And then lastly, you had a crazy priest from Detroit named Father Coughlin, who wanted FDR to completely take over the economy. Here's Father Coughlin telling the world his ideas. The term for taking over the economy, or nationalization, is what Father Coughlin wanted FDR to do. Now, FDR was hesitant to do that because he didn't want to come off as a total pinko commie, but Father Coughlin came down hard on him for not doing so. Now, the biggest critic of the New Deal wasn't an individual, rather it was a Supreme Court. And during the 1930s, the Supreme Court had a conservative majority that had been appointed by those conservative presidents of the 1920s. And this conservative majority did not enjoy New Deal policies whatsoever. They thought that these New Deal policies gave too much power to the federal government. So they invalidated the National Industrial Recovery Act, and they invalidated the Agricultural Adjustment Act, saying that these two acts violated the Constitution and gave too much power to the President and to Congress. And they did things that weren't allowed in the Constitution. Now, FDR tries to fix this problem by suggesting that he replace all judges over the age of 70 with new ones, and to increase the number of people on the Supreme Court from 9 to 15. Now, if you increase the number of people on the Supreme Court from 9 to 15, that means that FDR, since the president is given the ability to appoint Supreme Court justices, he would be able to pick all the new people who wouldn't go against his New Deal policies. Now, I think this court packing plan, if you will, which obviously is seen in a negative way by this cartoon, as you see in the background here, all the new people that are added to the Supreme Court are all FDR clones. So this is kind of a commentary on how FDR's idea to pack the court was just a way of him to extend his power. This got into the head of the Supreme Court, and they eventually backed down from invalidating all the parts of the New Deal, which gives way to the second New Deal. Now, the second New Deal is focused a lot more on long-term reform than was the first New Deal. The first New Deal was focused on immediate recovery and immediate relief to people, and then sort of helping the economy get back to the to the place that it was before the Great Depression. The second New Deal is going to be focused on long-term solutions. So 3 things that stand out in the second New Deal. The first is the Security Exchange Commission, or the SEC. You probably have heard about this before. This says that it's illegal for banks and others to insider trade stocks. So this is the reason why Martha Stewart went to jail, because she knew that some stocks were going to go down in price, so she sold them when they were higher. So the government is allowed to regulate the purchases of stocks to make sure that there's no rampant buying on margin, which, as you recall from our Great Depression web, was a reason why the Great Depression occurred. The Social Security Act, which is still around today, this is one of the largest government programs that provides pensions and to elderly and payment to those that are disabled or unable to work, was the brainchild of Francis Townsend. Now, even though Francis Townsend wanted FDR and Congress to appropriate more funds to people that aren't able to work, he didn't get as much as he wanted, but still, something is better than nothing. And then finally, the Wagner Act, which I mentioned earlier, but I love this act, so I just have to mention it again, protects unionized workers from being fired and allows them to collectively bargain. Now, obviously, the Wagner Act says a lot about what it takes to be a great country, and obviously, to be a great country, one votes communist. Okay, so now, drawing this to a close, the New Deal is often viewed in, its legacy at least, is often viewed in 3 parts, okay, and they all start with R. The first part is relief, and the relief part of the New Deal sought to provide immediate aid to unemployed people and poor citizens. So it did this by FERA, CCC, Works Progress Administration, things that gave people jobs or gave them immediate relief. The second R in the New Deal legacy is recovery, and these programs were designed to help the economy bounce back. So to help it get it back on its feet, the Agricultural Adjustment Act sought to do that, and the National Industrial Recovery Act sought to do that. And then finally, the third R, reform. Its purpose was to change the system to protect it from future depression. So the Wagner Act changed the system, allow workers to unionize so that when there are economic hard times, so many workers don't go without jobs or don't go without rights. And then the Social Security Act provides people that with payments, and they don't flood the workforce. So elderly people don't need to constantly be looking for jobs. Rather, they can exit the workforce but still have some money. Now, one of the most important legacies of the New Deal is how it changes voting in America. Many students often ask why, up until this point in history, the racist whites in the South were Democrats, and that in today's day and age, most racist whites in the South would vote Republican. That's not to say that all Republicans are racist whites, but that change occurs because of the New Deal. What happens is the Great Depression causes so much hardship for people that when they change the way they vote to line up with the New Deal, they're doing so because they see the New Deal as a way to help them. Remember, people vote based on the economy, and if the New Deal was something that helped you, you were going to vote in favor of it. So FDR creates what's called the New Deal Coalition, which is groups that join the Democratic Party as a result of aid they received from the New Deal. So these groups include labor unions, the help they received from the Wagner Act, political machines, minorities, especially black Americans, because the New Deal helped black Americans find jobs. Now, even though black Americans were disproportionately unemployed, more so than white Americans, still, black Americans saw the New Deal as something that helped them. So they switch from the party of Lincoln to the party of the New Deal. Farmers switch to the Democratic Party because they see the Agricultural Adjustment Act as something that helps them. They're not Democrats anymore. They're Republicans now. But that's because of stuff that happens in the 60s and 70s. White Southerners stay in the Democratic Party because most white Southerners are, you got it, poor white sharecroppers. And since poor white sharecroppers benefited from the New Deal, and especially from things like the Tennessee Valley Authority, which gave them electricity that they didn't have before, they liked the New Deal. And then finally, the elderly switch, obviously because of Social Security. Now, I don't want you to think that the New Deal is the be-all, end-all solution for the Great Depression. As you notice from this this chart, FDR's New Deal was implemented when unemployment rate was about 38%. 38% of workers were unemployed. Now, as the New Deal programs were implemented, it went down, 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 and then at the crisis point, so when FDR tried to pack the court and after the court had invalidated some of the New Deal's policies, unemployment shot back up again. But if you notice, during the New Deal, from about 1933 until 1940, unemployment is over 20% the entire time. That's a lot of unemployed people. Notice, what ends the New Deal? None other than World War II. If you have questions on the New Deal or FDR's response to the Great Depression, always feel free to email me or find me during seminar, before or after school,